Well, good evening, everybody. I think we'll make a start. So welcome to this webinar on what happens when clinical trials end. And we're recording this to have as a resource for the days when clinical trials fail or come to an end. Clinical trials fail more often than they succeed, and this is a very difficult fact to swallow. I liken it to a bit like the Titanic. You know, when your child is diagnosed, you feel lost, helpless, and drowning in sorrow. You feel as if you're being dragged to the bottom of the earth. And then you hear of a clinical trial of a promising medicine and your heart lifts. You've been given a place on a lifeboat. But what happens if you manage to get onto that lifeboat, only to find that months later, that's sinking too, and all of the hard work that you've put in to escape the sinking ship seems to have amounted to nothing. I don't mean this to sound over the top, but these are the emotions that I lived through when my son joined a trial and it failed. And it's not just me, but it's countless numbers of parents who Alex and I speak to who go through this. So we felt it was important to get down on record a really good understanding of why trials fail, why parents often find out on social media before being contacted by their sites. And we wanted you to understand that when you give your consent for your child to be on a trial, what are you actually agreeing to? And to try and discuss tonight with our panelists what can be done to lessen the burden on patients when trials come to an end or fail. Now, having said all that, I don't want people to lose heart. Research is at an unprecedented stage in Duchenne muscular dystrophy right now, and there are more trials than ever before. And thanks to the work of the DMD Hub in the UK, we now have 11 sites running clinical trials and the capacity to run more as they come through. Duchenne UK works really closely with the team at Newcastle and Gosh to deliver the hub. And so I honestly can't think of anyone who is better placed than our next speaker to do the opening presentation. But before I introduce him, some very quick housekeeping. Please do ask questions as we go, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will answer them in our panel discussion at the end of the presentations. So I'm now very pleased to introduce Volker Straub, the Harold Macmillan Professor of Medicine and Consultant in Neuromuscular Genetics and Pediatrics at the John Walton Muscular Dystrophy Research Centre. Thank you very much, Volker, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And just to make it clear that there was a typo, because Staub in Germany actually means dust, and that's not my name. Anyway, you pronounced it correctly, Emily Straub. So good evening, everyone, and thanks to Emily, Alex, and the entire Duchenne UK team to invite me to this webinar with a really important topic: what happens when clinical trials end. You know, everyone gets excited when clinical trials start, and we often can't wait for the first patient to be enrolled and for the trial to kick off. And even the healthcare professionals don't think enough about, well, they will come to an end. What happens actually? And I want to share some general thoughts about this. And let me now share my screen and go into presentation mode. It should hopefully happen. So what happens when clinical trials end? And it's not all bad. There are good cases as well, but often for the families and patients, as Emily pointed out, it is actually bad news. And I want to first of all make a disclosure statement, because I'm involved in a number of clinical trials here in Newcastle. Also through the Duchenne Hub, we are involved in many Duchenne trials and other trials. And therefore, there is a conflict of interest, and I have signed confidentiality agreements and can't talk about every clinical trial program, and I just wanted to point it out. I also think that just so that everyone is on the same page, I give some introductory remarks about what a clinical trial actually is, because sometimes we forget that clinical trials aren't treatments. I have this quote there: the clock is ticking for all of us in the same way, but time runs differently for everyone. Because for the Duchenne community, this is a statement that every family knows very well. And so there's hope with clinical trials, as Emily said, but clinical trials are experiments or observations, if it's a natural history study, done in clinical research. So it's human research. We hope to come to better treatments, but the trial itself is an experiment. And therefore, it's important that actually patients or trial subjects are protected as well from any experiments that aren't ethically sound. And the health authority or ethics committees are the ones that are responsible for vetting the risk-benefit ratio of the trial. Now, when a trial is approved, and the hospital also needs to approve this, so the hospital needs to confirm whether it has the setup to actually run the trial. That does not mean that the therapy is safe or effective. It only means that the trial may be conducted. Now, these are many of the headlines we have unfortunately seen in the Duchenne field over the past 15 years now. And it just shows that many trials ended. And I'll just point out three, assuming that you can see my mouse. So the Summit trial didn't meet the primary endpoint. The Lilly phase 3 trial didn't meet the primary endpoint. The PTC trial here didn't meet the primary endpoint. Now, it's really important to understand that these were successful trials. It's the drugs that failed, not the trials. The trial has clearly come to a result. So a clinical trial is successful if it can clearly demonstrate that an intervention or drug is effective and safe, or that it isn't, because none of us wants to have a drug that isn't effective and safe. Now, the trial fails if it's not able to show that. So unfortunately, there are trials that don't come to a clear conclusion. That's when the trial has failed, or when the trial is prematurely ended for reasons that have nothing to do with the drug. Then the trial has failed. But there are trials that are successful and the drugs fail, and we have to really be clear about this. Now, these are the typical stages of drug development, and you will have seen similar graphs before, that it unfortunately also takes a long time from the discovery, but the discovery often makes already headlines when you find a new compound that might improve cell cultures or mouse. And then there are often many years before you actually move into the clinical studies. And the clinical studies are listed here. They are classically divided into 3 phases, a phase 1, 2, or 3. Typically, the phase 1 is in healthy volunteers, just to see whether the drug is safe. For some treatments, that's impossible. For example, gene therapy or antisense therapy cannot be tested in healthy volunteers because they would potentially be damaging. Then you go into a phase 2 study where you normally test your doses and you also test whether there is some efficacy. But to register a drug and to get it approved, you would normally go into a phase 3 trial. The challenge with Duchenne and other rare diseases is that it can be difficult to get enough patients together. And I'll come back to this later. And therefore, many companies already try to even get a drug approved with a phase 2 trial. Now, once a drug seems to be effective in a clinical study, it then still needs to go through an approval process. And even once it is approved, it can still take a while before it is accessible through, in the UK, in the NHS. And then you can continue to actually test this drug for side effects after it has been approved in so-called phase 4 studies. Now, the challenge is that sometimes clinical studies might actually drag on. And we have experiences in the UK in some of the Duchenne trials as well. And so even though the study protocol might suggest the trial is only for an individual patient 2 years or 1 year, before you have sufficient patients that are recruited, it can take a long time. And therefore, the study, although for an individual patient, is only for 12 months, with extension and with delayed recruitment, this can go for years sometimes. And it's also difficult for the company then to decide, well, how long do we actually continue? But the topic of the seminar is more, well, what happens if the study actually ends and there's no hope for approval and access to an effective and safe drug? Now, early termination is something that is clearly defined. And it says here, and I'm sorry that some of the slides are a bit text heavy, premature termination is when a clinical trial is stopped earlier than planned, before the pre-designated endpoints of the trial are reached. Now, it's important to understand that the regulatory agencies will rarely, if ever, tell a sponsor, the company that is running the trial, or the academic that is running the trial and responsible for the trial, which decision to make, but only provide scientific and regulatory guidance on the possible implications of early termination. So ultimately, it is in our commercial studies, the company that will need to make this decision. But there are also other bodies involved. So this would be the trial sponsor, the investigator is the healthcare professional, the doctor at the site where the trial takes place, the patients, that's the community, of course, that participates in trials. And then there is often a CRO involved. This is basically a company that supports the pharmaceutical company in running the trial. Many smaller pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies would not have the knowledge or logistics to really run a clinical trial. So they work together with other companies, the CROs. And of course, ultimately, you want to then provide your data to the regulators to get approval. But what's really important that in many, probably all interventional trials, you have a so-called data safety monitoring board. And just to explain what this data monitoring committee or data safety monitoring board or data monitoring, DMC, clinical trial data monitoring group is, it's a group of individuals with specific expertise that review on a regular basis data from the study. So this is independent of trial involvement. None of them is allowed to actually be involved in the trial. They just review data externally, independently. They also have the right to, for example, unblind, which means if someone is on a placebo or on the real drug, because they have the responsibility to advise the sponsor whether to continue or to end the trial. So I regularly get correspondence from pharmaceutical companies telling me that their data safety monitoring board has met and decided that the trial can continue. That's what normally happens. Sometimes you will get a letter and says, actually, the data monitoring safety board has decided to terminate the trial. And so what are the reasons why clinical trials are terminated? And so this is a pie chart that lists the various reasons. Some of them are overlapping, but the most common reason why trials are prematurely terminated is the low accrual rate. So in rare diseases in particular, we sometimes struggle to find enough patients for a trial. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning, that the protocol might say only for 12 months, an individual patient is part of the trial. But if it takes 3 years to get sufficient patients, enrolled, then the trial cannot conclude. And for this individual patient, you need to go in a so-called extension study. And the second most common reason is lack of efficacy. Now, the first one is really frustrating for every family and every patient and every healthcare professional, because you think, well, maybe they should have planned this better. Maybe they should have included more trial sites. Maybe they should have gone to more countries, to be successful in completing a trial. Now, the lack of efficacy is what I showed you at the beginning with the Summit or the Lilly trial or the PTC. If there's no efficacy, it's not that the trial has failed, it's that the drug has failed. And so there's no need for frustration. The same is true for adverse events. If it turns out in a clinical trial that the drug actually has side effects that are not something that you feel is worth risking, you might end the trial. And we have had this in Duchenne as well, where, you know, the early GSK or Biomarin study later on showed lack of efficacy and adverse events and was terminated very quickly. Now, financial, normally a company needs to show when they submit protocol for a trial that they have sufficient funds. But if a trial drags on, it can happen that companies run out of money, which would be, of course, very frustrating. Normally, that's something that the regulators will look at. Business strategic decisions, you know, that's management. Again, that doesn't take patients' interest into account, just company interest, can be very frustrating. Product discontinuation, we have just seen this in one of our projects unrelated to Duchenne, where a trial that was using drugs for repurposing, something that Duchenne UK is very supportive of, because these drugs can often be tested quicker, are often cheaper, but it can also happen that a company decides to take such a drug off the market because they are not interested in this. And all of a sudden, you have planned a trial, but you have no drug anymore. Just happened in a big pediatric trial that we were part of as a project team. Then regulatory issues, it can happen that, again, the regulators might decide that the risk-benefit, for example, isn't balanced, and that, you know, this, as I said, there's some overlap, that it might be too dangerous. Protocol deviation, you know, if you get regulators again reviewing a trial, so both the FDA in the US or the EMA or MHRA, they come and visit sites and have the right to do this at any time and to look how everything is going. And if they feel that, look, there are a lot of deviations, the protocol isn't followed, they can decide to stop as well. Now, the only green smiley is really positive outcome. Sometimes it would be unethical to continue a trial if the Data Monitoring Safety Board, for example, sees that the placebo group is a lot worse than the group of patients that receive the drug. And they feel it's not ethically justifiable to continue this to disadvantage a group of patients. Now, we have seen this in spinal muscular atrophy, for example, that a number of trials were stopped prematurely because the drug effect was so obvious and beneficial that they say it's not justifiable to continue, that some patients don't receive the treatment. And so these other ethical considerations, again, I mean, they overlap a bit and are very rare. But the low accrual rate is a problem and is one of the reasons also in Duchenne why trials take so long. Now, if recruitment of participants has proved challenging, and it is unlikely that the scientific question will ever be answered, I would also agree that it is considered unethical to continue the trial. But again, that means there might be bad planning. So in these situations, the regulatory authorities that approve the study must agree to the termination. Ultimately, it's a decision of the sponsor. What's really important, and what the Data Monitoring Safety Board also, but also sometimes the companies base decisions on, is the so-called interim analysis of a trial. So in most cases, the decision to end the trial early is made after new scientific evidence emerges, often during planned interim analysis. So it's already anticipated that, you know, we have to look if there are any problems. This new trial data may lead to a reassessment of the benefit-risk ratio for the participants, such as, you know, for example, a serious side effect, where the risk to the participant is considered too great to continue treatment. Clear identification of the superiority or lack of effect of one of the treatments. So in trials that allow the trial to be stopped following an interim analysis, clearly defined stopping rules must be included in the protocol and in the informed consent form. And it is, again, something that might not always be obvious when we discuss the trial and the protocol and the informed consent form, because everyone is excited about the trial starting, and we don't discuss, well, what might actually happen. And so it's your right as well. And the sponsor is obliged, and the investigator as well, to inform families what are the stopping rules. Now, the most obvious reason for stopping a trial is severe side effects. So it will be listed in the protocol. If this happens, then the individual patient might stop, but if it happens to too many patients, then the trial might stop. So this should include provision after the trial stops for access to continued treatment if beneficial and needed, as described in the Declaration of Helsinki. So what this says is, if a trial is stopped, but there is some evidence that the treatment is actually beneficial and would help. Let's say the trial is stopped because there are not enough patients enrolled, but the patients that are enrolled think that they benefited and the data also support this, then there's an obligation to actually think about how you continue the treatment. Now, an independent committee should make the decision about whether the data returned from an interim analysis meet the stopping criteria in order to decrease bias. And in most cases, stopping a clinical trial requires approval of senior medical management. I'll just give you, I'll end my introduction with three examples. So the first example of a study continuation, and these are examples from trial protocols. So I've looked through our protocols. I haven't revealed the companies or the drug trials, but here it says, the sponsor reserves the right to terminate the study at any time. Should this be necessary, the sponsor and the investigators will arrange discontinuation procedures and notify the appropriate ethic boards. In terminating the study, the sponsor and the investigator will assure that adequate consideration is given to the protection of the subject's interest. Now, if you read this, it is fairly vague. It does say, consideration is given. It's not that the sponsor here, the company, commits to this. Understandably, of course, because it is a big commitment. But these are things that we probably need to discuss in more detail. And we is, the patients, the families, with the investigators and the healthcare professionals conducting the trial. Now, this is another example where the only mentioning of a possible extension was in one sentence, where it really says that the trial and its possible extension. So it wasn't really clear in the protocol, well, will they extend it or not? Often companies are, of course, asked to make it clear what kind of exit strategy they have and which kind of extension, if they are planning extension trials. And these are just two other examples where it is defined, in this case for a single patient, up to 3 years, screening period, then 49 weeks, which is a year blinded treatment, and then there's a follow-up of 2 years. And here also for an individual patient, 4 weeks screening and then 12 months. But this is not necessarily what will always happen in reality, that for an individual patient, drug approval, of course, depends when everyone has finished and there's a data log and the trial is shown to be successful. So what are the lessons learned? I think there are 3 lessons. When consenting to participate in a trial, you need to ask about the exit strategy. What happens when the trial ends? And I'm not just saying this as a message to families and patients, but this is also something important for us as clinicians who do clinical trials, that we take this serious and discuss this so that it doesn't come as a huge surprise. There needs to be, I think, a lot more transparency about trial results, and the publication of negative trial data is important. Too often we, I think, are left without a clear explanation and access to data that show why a trial has failed. But coming back to Emily's initial message as well, drug development is complex, but it is important. And of course, we need to continue to do clinical trials to ultimately have access to safe and efficient treatments. That was my introduction, and I'll hand over to Emily again.
Volker, thank you so much. That was a really informative and very clear introduction to some of the issues that we're facing. And I think we're going to be discussing in our panel session, the very delicate balance that we have to strike between not making clinical trials any more onerous to set up and to run, but also to somehow try and think of the patient in that and give them greater protection. So now it's time to turn to Emma Hallam, who is the mother of Alex and founder of Alex's Wish. And she's here to really help give us the patient perspective on what it's like to be on a clinical trial and what happens when that trial ends. So if I can come to you, Emma. So first of all, what trial was Alex on?
He was on the Pfizer anti-myostatin clinical trial, and he took part in that clinical trial. Gosh, he looks so young there. He's 15 now.
How old was he when he started on the trial?
So he was, how old was Alex? He would have been about 8 years old. So it was the first clinical trial that he had been enrolled on. We tried to enroll him on a number of trials before then, but unfortunately wasn't successful because he was not in the right age bracket. So when we got on the Pfizer trial, we were really excited and hopeful, and everything that Volker was just talking about, it was a really exciting time. It was a long journey.
And he was on that trial for around 2 years, is that right?
No, it was over 3 years in the end. He was on it, well over 3 years. So yes, it was a long journey that we went on from the start of the trial, and we didn't know at first whether or not he was on the placebo or if he was on a low dose drug. We didn't quite know what was going on, but then as the trial extended, we then knew that he would either be on the low dose or the high dose of the drug at some point.
So talk me through when that trial ended, how did you find out?
Yes, that was a bit of a shock actually, because I was in the office and I received an email, and I was literally just about to leave the office and go and pick Alex up from school when the email popped up, and I knew it was about the trial. So I opened it and read it, and just it was such a shock to read that information that the trial has just ended.
You were told that by the clinician, were you?
Yes, I believe we were actually. I'm trying to think who the email was from now, because it was a while ago. But if I remember rightly, I don't even think we couldn't even speak to Newcastle at the time because they were so busy having to try and get through all the patients to ring them. It wasn't possible to obviously speak to all the patients before the data was released, before the information was released. So it did come as a complete shock and out of the blue. Had no prior warning that the trial was going to end.
How did you feel when you read that email?
I burst into tears straight away. That was the first response. And I must admit at the time I felt embarrassed because I was in front of people and there was, what's happened, what's gone on? And it was such a shock to me. That was the first reaction that I had. And I just remember feeling like it was literally somebody had rang me up and said, somebody has died. It felt so kind of shocking to me because we've been on it for so long. And we got all the appointments in the diary. We got them all lined up because Alex was going to Newcastle every single month. So it did come as a huge shock. And I think literally I had to leave the office, go and pick Alex up. And straight away, he knew that I was upset and said to me, what's wrong? And I said, look, just received news that the Pfizer trial that you've been on is no longer, it's ended. And Alex's first reaction was, well, that's it. I'm never going to go on a trial again. He just felt, again, it was such a shock to the system. And the first thing he said to me was, I'm never going to go on another trial again. It's been a waste of my heart, most of his life, because 3.5 years when you're literally 11 years old is a huge chunk of your life. And the other thing was, which surprised me, well, not surprising, but actually one of the first things that he did say was, but I really enjoy going to Newcastle. I love going to Newcastle. We go to the cinema, we go out for a meal. He loves going and seeing everybody at Newcastle because they became like friends. And I think that's what was really upsetting for him straight away. It was like, but are we not going to Newcastle then next week? Because I think we've got the next appointment was literally the following week. And he was really concerned the fact that we're just not going to Newcastle now. Is that it?
And was it that, so the shock for you, was that because you felt that you could see that the treatment was working, or was it just the disruption to routine, or what was the major driver of that shock for you and for Alex?
I think for me, the major driving force behind it was the fact that Alex was doing really well. And we genuinely thought that the drug was keeping him stable because he'd been on it so long, and he was 11 years old, he was still not in a wheelchair. So we genuinely thought he's stable, he's doing great, it must be the drug, maybe it's doing some good for him. And so for me, it was more the fact that that's it, the trial has ended. So one, the drug can't be working, but what if it is working for Alex? And I think from Alex's point of view, it was more, I'm not going to Newcastle next week, I'm going to miss going to Newcastle, I'm going to miss seeing everybody. And secondly, it was a case of, most shockingly really, because Alex had was just starting senior school, and he genuinely thought that by not taking the drug that he was going to decline quite rapidly. And from his point of view, he was like, is that it now then? Am I going to be going into a wheelchair soon? So because he thought that by not being in a wheelchair could possibly, which we all thought in some way, that it could be the trial that's working. It could be the drug. So we had I guess we put so much hope into it, which you do when you're on a clinical trial. It's really difficult to say, oh, it might not be working. It's probably not likely to be working, because I think, it's the placebo effect, isn't it? If you're on a clinical trial, and even if you're on the placebo effect, you feel like it's doing you some good. And the other really important thing is, because we were going to Newcastle like every single month, he was being seen by the physiotherapist. I was seeing the consultant. So if we had any queries whatsoever, even from Alex's point of view, we were able to get those questions answered really quickly. We didn't have to wait for the 6-monthly appointment. And I think that's, for me, a big loss as well, knowing that I wasn't going to see all the clinicians, on a regular basis, like every single month.
Right. So it was the double whammy of not having the trial and also not having access to that expertise. Okay, well, Emma, thank you very much indeed for sharing your experiences, and we'll come back to you on the panel session. It's now time to go to Matt Anderton from WAVE, who is Head of Clinical Development, and he is going to give the industry perspective. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, and can I just check you can see it?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
You have to, works well now. Great.
Excellent. So yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Emily. So I've been asked to speak as obviously I work at WAVE Life Sciences. Just in terms of a background, we were developing a product, suvodirsen, for exon skipping, specifically those for amenable to exon skipping of 51. But the program was discontinued in December 2019. So I'm not going to focus on the results of our trial. I've just been asked really to speak, as somebody from a sponsor and sort of the general processes that happen from the sponsor side when a clinical trial ends, and the reasons. Volker's obviously gone through a number of reasons why studies end. So I just again wanted to reiterate some of those points. So study data, it becomes available at different points within a clinical trial. The company, the sponsor, will evaluate that at a number of set points. Volker mentioned there's data monitoring committees and data safety monitoring boards, and they provide that independent review. So we're constantly, as a sponsor, evaluating safety, and independent committees will review that data as well. Often look at unblinded data. So a lot of these clinical trials are placebo controlled, so they're double blind. The patient doesn't know what they're on, or the families. The investigator at the clinical trial site doesn't know what they're on, and the sponsor doesn't know what they're on. So they rely on these independent committees to look at that data and decide whether the trial can continue, or unfortunately it may have to come to an end. There are also junctures within the study as well that are predetermined interim analysis. So at a certain point, the sponsor will say in advance that we're going to look at that data and assess that risk benefit profile. So whether the drug is safe and we are able to continue, but also whether it's doing something, whether it's efficacious and working. And of course, if a drug isn't working, then any amount of risk really isn't acceptable. So that's another point at which sponsors will look at that data and when it will become available. And the other is at the completion of the study. So I've already alluded to the fact that often studies are blinded, so that really influences and drives when that data is released, and that new information typically is either efficacy, so whether the study medication works, or safety related. So I mean, one of the comments that Emma made, in how she found out about the Pfizer trial ending, I just wanted to explain a bit about what happens the first day that occurs, and perhaps explain a little bit, because in a number of instances, sponsor companies' hands are effectively tied. So publicly limited companies, so that's companies that have shareholders, have a legal obligation. So this is European regulations, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. So it depends where you're listed as a company and where your shareholders buy shares from. But they have a legal obligation to release information to everybody at the same time when they become aware of something that is classified as material. So by that, I mean something that is likely to significantly impact the company, right? And obviously in the case of a trial that's terminated early, that is a big deal to a lot of biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, depending on the size of them, there may be some slight differences as whether they have to release that information. But for smaller companies like Wave and like a number of others that are involved in Duchenne muscular dystrophy research, it has a big impact to the operations of the company, and so they're legally bound to put out a press release. And that typically happens about an hour before stock markets open. So even, that is sort of mandated as to when we're able to release that information. The sponsor emails all the investigators in the study in parallel with that press release. So everything's set up effectively to go out at the same time. And then the sponsor will call the investigators, the study nurses, etc., to make them aware, and also to provide some guidance to the participants and their families, particularly those who are at the site that day. And from our experience at Wave, there was the patients were coming in for weekly infusions and study visits, and so there were a number of patients that day that were in clinic and waiting to be dosed that day. So we go through and inform the sites as rapidly as we can. And typically as well, the sponsor will put an open letter to the families and to the patient community on their website, and also ask for patient advocacy groups like Duchenne UK to put that information on their site, and also disseminate it to the on newsletters, etc., and their email groups. But as a sponsor, we can't have the details of any of the patients that take part in our trials. So we can't email them directly for confidentiality reasons and impartiality reasons. So it sounds or could appear callous, but as I say, it is unfortunately something that we have to do in this way. So it's everybody finds out at the same time, and therefore you can often get emails or find out on social media more rapidly than you will get the information coming from the clinical site, and that's simply just because of their bandwidth being able to call all the families and digest and release that information themselves. After that first day, the people that took part in the trial participants usually come in for a follow-up visit. And at that, they have the opportunity to ask further questions to the investigator or the study team. Now, obviously, depending on when that is, there may be a paucity of data at that point. That's, it may just be reiterating what the press release has said, but then more data will follow after it as it's collected, analysed, and released. Typically, when there's sort of interim analysis, there's a lot more data to the clinical trial, so more of that has to be sort of assembled and also checked, independently monitored by a clinical research organisation, and then released to the sponsor. So we then typically share all the results at a conference or a patient advocacy community meeting. And we have a legal obligation as well to publish the results on clinicaltrials.gov or the EU Clinical Trials Register. And also that we transfer the data from that each particular site back to them. So that is all the data that's captured in what's called an ECRF, an electronic case report form. So all the study related information that's collected about a patient that the investigator site put in, we then send that back to them. But that process takes a long time, typically 6 to 12 months after the last patient has been in the context of a trial. So it can often seem like there's a big gap between the press release and the announcement that a trial is terminating early, and then some of that data feeding its way back to the investigator's site. So the last slide I wanted to focus on here is, what we learn when trials have negative results. And, I think we've heard obviously from Emma before, and also from Volker, that, it's incredibly hard to deal with. But even though it's a shock and it's not what anybody wants, nobody goes and starts a clinical trial or wants to take part in a clinical trial thinking that it's not going to work. Everyone has that hope, including the sponsor. But we learn something from every single trial, every single visit, and everyone that participates in that trial. And it's incredibly useful and valuable for the future of DMD research. So what I mean by that is the data that you analyze and collect in a trial, even if it's negative, can be used to improve future ones. So at Wave, we're in the process of starting a new clinical trial where we've looked at what happened with suvodirsen and have learned from that and built on it and looked for areas that the drug wasn't working to try and improve on that. The data itself can also be used not just by an individual sponsor, but by other future sponsors to reduce the number of patients that need to take part in a trial. And so the next piece, I just want to give that as an example. So Wave had a phase 3 suvodirsen program approved to take part in an FDA. So this is the American equivalent of the MHRA, so the regulatory body that approves medicines and also clinical trials. They had a program called the Complex and Innovative Trial Design Program. And Wave was the first company to be able to take part in this. And what we were looking to do is use some of the data from previous trials. So some that had been successful, but also a number that had failed, to supplement the trial data that we were going to be gathering to reduce the number of patients that would need to take part in the trial, but also those that would need to that would be allocated placebo. And so, you can see that the collection of this data is helping the community as a whole, and it is moving things forward, even though at the time it probably doesn't feel like it. The participation in trial is just incredibly valuable. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on, because I think it has come up in this, is one thing we wanted to do at Wave was to provide the patient's individual data back to the sites. Now, we can't, again, because we don't know the individual patients or their families' details, and we can't contact them directly. It has to be through the investigator. Anything that goes to a patient has to also be approved by an ethics committee. So what we did was, effectively produced PDFs of all the study data or the relevant study information and gave that back to the sites. So they could use that as the basis of a discussion with each of the individual patients that took part. So there was, all the functional tests that are done during a trial, the blood results, any adverse events that they might have had, but also, in the WAVE trial, there was muscle biopsies, so representative images of those muscle biopsies. And unfortunately, the data wasn't positive, but we wanted to provide that back to the families via the investigators so that they could hopefully share that and have that discussion. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody on behalf of WAVE that took part in our trial and takes part in trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy by and large, because it really does make a difference, even as we've said on this, in the event that the drug trials don't work out.
Matthew, thanks ever so much indeed for that presentation. Very helpful and very useful, and really good to see the initiatives that WAVE are introducing to help share data. And I'm actually going to dive in straight to that data question, which is one of the first questions that came in on the chat. I'm going to come to Volker first and then Sajal. Janet Blore asks, when a trial fails, why isn't the data returned to the patients automatically? We know that companies have to publish on clinicaltrials.gov, but it's not, but individualized patient data is not given to patients. She's still waiting on Santhera's Sideros data. Volker, why doesn't this happen? And do you think it should or could happen?
I think what we have to discuss first probably is what data we are talking about. So some data, of course, I think would be extremely difficult to see without the context of data as another. What Matthew said, the dystrophin is something fairly easy for an individual patient. But if you, let's say, get the ejection fraction or the fat fraction in a muscle MRI, that might not mean anything to the family. Then the question is, how do you transfer these data? How do you actually, convert the data into something meaningful? So I think it is a bit more complex, but generally, I do think that each patient should, through the investigator, have the opportunity to ask about data, because many of the data are also captured by the clinical team. So like the 6-minute walking distance, you can of course then ask, because the physiotherapists know this. But it's important that you have the approval from the sponsor. And so as a clinical trial investigator, I basically have a contract with the sponsor as well, that I treat data confidentially, and it's part of the consent form. So it's really important. In every consent form, there will be sections that explain who gets access to the data and whom can you ask, and whether the company shares these data. I think generally it's a good idea, yes, but it depends also on the data and how meaningful it is outside the context of a clinical trial.
Yes, I mean, even as something as simple as, was my child on placebo or not?
Yeah.
Would be really, I think families would be really grateful to know that. Sajal, with your experience of the work you do on patient data, do you think data should be shared with patients when a trial ends?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, from what Emma was saying as well, she was convinced that this drug was working for Alex, and I think it's so important to share the data, because it actually increases contribution and learning to the science as well. So, for example, if there's something on the data which Emma and Alex could actually and give insights to, this would actually and it will actually add value and show what the data is actually, it could actually show what it's showing. And if the data is not shared, then it could miss these valuable contributions. So, for example, you could see something in a biomarker which Emma or Alex could explain, So it really could provide insights to them. And I think from a psychological point of view, you do want to know. You want to know, how your child is doing, and what they did on the trial. And also, like Emma said, Alex spent three years on the trial. It's burdensome, and so the data should be offered as a reward for the commitment and the time for the patients. And it's something that we hear all the time, that patients want to see their data, and the question that we've had tells us that as well. Patients want their data.
Yeah, thanks very much. And another question, and Volker, it was very surprising to see in your slide that the low accrual rate is such a major issue for why trials are terminated. Question from Simon Pittman: if it's such a major issue, why are so many trials limited to children aged 4 to 7? And if we extended that age range, would we get around this problem?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And the reason for this is that through your inclusion and exclusion criteria, you limit your inclusion, but you want to give your drug the best chance to be successful if it works. And it is assumed that the more homogeneous the patient group is, the easier it is to show an effect of the drug. So the more you reduce the noise, the better for the drug. Now, if you would increase the age, for example, you would also increase the noise. And it's a fine balance. And yes, I think sometimes this is exactly what companies need to think about. Would it be worth extending the age range or including more trial sites? Some of this would jeopardize the drug maybe, but some of this is also a question of costs.
Thanks, Volker. There's a follow-up question from Lucy Fairs about, can we be more transparent about the accrual rates? For instance, could we put the metrics on the Hub website so we are all aware of the numbers? And if we know that a trial is struggling to recruit, can we do something about it? We talk to each other on different forums. I mean, I think that's an excellent suggestion. What do you think, Volker?
Yeah, I read the question and I thought, really important probably that there are ways and opportunities that we can work more closely together as a community, whether it's through the Duchenne Hub and the clinical trial finder and the metrics there. Let's say right now there are companies that look for more patients with specific mutations for the antisense oligonucleotides. And sometimes we as a clinician, we don't know, I mean, are there more patients? How can we get them? It takes a long time. So this is where having patient registries, working closely with patient advocacy is really important. And I think the clinical trial finder or the Duchenne Hub is exactly a tool that was implemented to make sure that trial recruitment is also better. It's not just about capacity. So yeah, I mean, anything we can do to enroll more patients is something we should.
Yeah. Thanks, Volker. I'm going to go to a question now from Kate McCurdy, which I think is a really important issue about how communications are managed. And Matt, I thought your slide was very interesting on what happens on the first day, but I think, in this era that we now live in of social media, it amplifies everything and accelerates everything. So when you make an announcement to the stock market, obviously that's on social media and it's in everyone's feeds before their clinicians even have a chance, maybe even to switch on their computers. Perhaps I could ask you, perhaps this is a question for the whole panel, bearing in mind we haven't got much time, but how do you think communications with the participants could work best to ensure that patients find out, in a more timely way and with more sensitivity?
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly tough one, just because of, as you say, just the speed at which feeds and news feeds. A lot of people have Google alerts, which will be almost instantaneous, and I think it is hard because of those obligations, as I say, and also working with trials internationally. So if you've got sites in Australia, Europe, US, Canada, etc., the time zone differences when something goes out causes complexity. The investigators in a lot of those regions will be in bed and only get the message a few hours later. So I don't really know what we can do to to improve that speed. I mean, in an ideal world, the investigators and by default the patients would find out in advance of everyone else, but unfortunately, because of the fact that could affect the share price and that information could leak, I mean, you can't. So I think the other thing would just be about preparing families for that, that this could come, and I suppose forewarning people that when this happens, it will happen rapidly, and just to sort of to understand that and go in with your eyes open, that is likely how it will occur.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this webinar, is to, as Volker said at the beginning, a trial is just that. It's a trial of an experimental medicine. But it just strikes me, Matt, that, there is a legal obligation on companies to release information because it's pertinent to their share price. Where is the ethical obligation to, have the interest of patients? And maybe we're there talking about a whole systemic change, which maybe is unrealistic to aim for. What are your thoughts on this, Volker?
So I think coming back to what Matthew said at the end here, I think a lot of this is about having this discussion, preparing the patient community, and it's not just the patient community, it's also the clinical trial sites, also through the hub, informing all of us, that this is the legal framework, this could happen. I think, I definitely through this webinar have already learned that when I consent the next patient, I'll pay more attention to, this could happen, the trial could end. And in some cases, we want it to end because the drug isn't safe, but there are other risk factors. So I think it's really helpful to already have this discussion and educate all of us about, the anticipation, managing perceptions of clinical trials. I mean, coming back to your example at the beginning of the Titanic and the lifeboat, I think, when a ship sinks, it is always a disaster. But having these lifeboats, is something that we just need to make people aware of. There are ways how we can make sure that this isn't just all, going to be terrible, but there are ways to make it a bit milder.
Thanks so much, Volker. We are almost at time. I'm just going to quickly ask the other panelists for final thoughts. Emma, would you, how does Alex feel now about clinical trials? Would he still join one?
Yes, he would, absolutely. He's on a clinical trial now. He's on the Il Pharmaco trial back up at Newcastle, and yeah, I just want to say all the bad side effects that of finding out trial ends, it did not stop us from going back and doing another trial. It took some time, but we went back into it, and Alex is back up at Newcastle, and yeah, fingers crossed on this one.
That's great news. And Sajal, any last thoughts from you on patients and data and trials?
Yes, I was just going to say that, and I think, when a clinical trial ends, we all hear that it's devastating and with the hope. But I think what is important is that there's some psychological assistance provided. And I think there needs to be some work done on that from the industry and from the sites to ensure that there is somebody there that somebody has to talk to. Especially when they feel so let down.
That's a really good thought to end with, Sajal, and that gives us something to work on going forward. So thank you ever so much to everyone for joining and for listening, and thank you very much for our panelists, and I hope you have a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.